Acting 6. Metaphor. An implied comparison between two otherwise unlike elements, meaningful in a figurative rather than literal sense. Learning objectives. Identify the 4 categories of film acting and their purposes within film. Contrast the differences between stage and screen acting, and identify why those differences make film the director's medium. Summarize the history of the American star system, including the golden age of film stars, and list benefits and drawbacks to being a film star. Summarize the history of the American star system, including the golden age of film stars, and list benefits and drawbacks to being a film star. Describe the importance of casting in film, and explain why some actors try to avoid typecasting. Describe the importance of casting in film, and explain why some actors try to avoid typecasting.
Film acting is a complex and variable art that can be broken down into 4 categories. 1. Extras. These actors are used primarily to provide a sense of a crowd, as in a cast of thousands. Players of this type are used as camera material, like a landscape or a set. 2. Non-professional performers. These are amateur players who are chosen not because of their acting ability, which can be negligible, but because of their authentic appearance. They look right for a given part. 3. Trained professionals. These stage and screen performers are capable of playing a variety of roles in a variety of styles. The majority of actors fall into this category. 4. Stars. These are famous performers who are widely recognized by the public. Their drawing power is one of the main attractions of a film or stage play. The star system was developed and has been dominated by the American cinema, though it's hardly unique to movies. Virtually all the performing arts, opera, dance, live theater, television, concert music, have exploited the box office popularity of a charismatic performer. No matter how a film actor is classified, virtually all performers in this medium concede that their work is shaped by the person who literally and figuratively calls the shots. Even Charlie Chaplin, the most famous movie star of his era, admitted, film acting is unquestionably a director's medium. In short, the movie actor is ultimately a tool of the director, another language system that the filmmaker uses to communicate ideas and emotions. Stage and screen acting. The differences between stage and screen acting are largely determined by the differences in space and time in each medium. See also Chapter 7, Dramatization. In general, the live theater seems to be a more satisfactory medium for the actor because, once the curtain goes up, he or she tends to dominate the proceedings. In movies, this is not usually the case. Actress Kim Stanley expressed the differences well. No matter what you do in film, it is, after all, bits and pieces for the director, and that's marvelous for the director, but it doesn't allow the actor to learn to mold a part. In films, it's the director who is the artist. An actor has much more chance to create on stage. Even the requirements are different in each medium. The essential requisites for the stage performer are to be seen and heard clearly. Thus, the ideal theatrical actor must have a flexible, trained voice. Most obviously, their voices must be powerful enough to be heard even in a theater containing thousands of seats. Because language is the major source of meaning in the theater, the nuances of the dialogue must be conveyed through vocal expressiveness. An actor's voice must be capable of much variety. It's necessary to know what words to stress and how to stress them, how to phrase properly for different types of lines, when to pause and for how long, and how quickly or slowly a line or speech ought to be delivered. Above all, the stage actor must be believable, even when reciting dialogue that's highly stylized and unnatural. Most of the credit for an exciting theatrical production is given to the performers, but much of the burden is also theirs, for when we're bored by a production of a play, we tend to blame the actors. Physical requirements are less exacting in the theater than in movies. Most obviously, the stage actor must be seen, even from the back of the auditorium. Thus, it helps to be tall, for small actors tend to get lost on a large stage. It also helps to have large and regular features, although makeup can cover a multitude of deficiencies. For this reason, casting a 40-year-old actor as Romeo is not necessarily a disaster in the theater, for if the actor is in reasonably good physical shape, his age won't show beyond the first rows of seats. Because of the low visual saturation in the theater, actors can play roles 20 years beyond their actual age, provided their voices and bodies are flexible enough. The stage actor's entire body is always in view, and for this reason, he or she must be able to control it with some degree of precision. Such obvious activities as sitting, walking, and standing are performed differently on the stage than they are in real life. An actor must usually learn how to dance, how to fence, and how to move naturally in period costumes. An actor must know what to do with his or her hands, when to let them hang and when to use them for expressive gestures. Furthermore, stage actors must know how to adjust their bodies to different characters. A 17-year-old girl moves differently than a woman of 30, an aristocrat moves differently than a clerk of the same age. The body must communicate a wide variety of emotions in pantomime. A happy person even stands differently than one who is dejected or fearful or bored. Film acting is a complex and variable art that can be broken down into 4 categories. 1. Extras. These actors are used primarily to provide a sense of a crowd, as in a cast of thousands. Players of this type are used as camera material, like a landscape or a set. 2. Non-professional performers. These are amateur players who are chosen not because of their acting ability, which can be negligible, but because of their authentic appearance. They look right for a given part. 3. Trained professionals. These stage and screen performers are capable of playing a variety of roles in a variety of styles. The majority of actors fall into this category. 4. Stars. These are famous performers who are widely recognized by the public. Their drawing power is one of the main attractions of a film or stage play. The star system was developed and has been dominated by the American cinema, though it's hardly unique to movies. Virtually all the performing arts, opera, dance, live theater, television, concert music, have exploited the box office popularity of a charismatic performer. No matter how a film actor is classified, virtually all performers in this medium concede that their work is shaped by the person who literally and figuratively calls the shots. Even Charlie Chaplin, the most famous movie star of his era, admitted, film acting is unquestionably a director's medium. In short, the movie actor is ultimately a tool of the director, another language system that the filmmaker uses to communicate ideas and emotions. Stage and screen acting. The differences between stage and screen acting are largely determined by the differences in space and time in each medium. See also Chapter 7, Dramatization. In general, the live theater seems to be a more satisfactory medium for the actor because, once the curtain goes up, he or she tends to dominate the proceedings. In movies, this is not usually the case. Actress Kim Stanley expressed the differences well. No matter what you do in film, it is, after all, bits and pieces for the director, and that's marvelous for the director, but it doesn't allow the actor to learn to mold a part. In films, it's the director who is the artist. An actor has much more chance to create on stage. Even the requirements are different in each medium. The essential requisites for the stage performer are to be seen and heard clearly. Thus, the ideal theatrical actor must have a flexible, trained voice. Most obviously, their voices must be powerful enough to be heard even in a theater containing thousands of seats. Because language is the major source of meaning in the theater, the nuances of the dialogue must be conveyed through vocal expressiveness. An actor's voice must be capable of much variety. It's necessary to know what words to stress and how to stress them, how to phrase properly for different types of lines, when to pause and for how long, and how quickly or slowly a line or speech ought to be delivered. Above all, the stage actor must be believable, even when reciting dialogue that's highly stylized and unnatural. Most of the credit for an exciting theatrical production is given to the performers, but much of the burden is also theirs, for when we're bored by a production of a play, we tend to blame the actors. Physical requirements are less exacting in the theater than in movies. Most obviously, the stage actor must be seen, even from the back of the auditorium. Thus, it helps to be tall, for small actors tend to get lost on a large stage. It also helps to have large and regular features. Although makeup can cover a multitude of deficiencies. For this reason, Casting a 40-year-old actor as Romeo is not necessarily a disaster in the theater, for if the actor is in reasonably good physical shape, his age won't show beyond the first rows of seats. Because of the low visual saturation in the theater, actors can play roles 20 years beyond their actual age, provided their voices and bodies are flexible enough. The stage actor's entire body is always in view, and for this reason, he or she must be able to control it with some degree of precision. Such obvious activities as sitting, walking, and standing are performed differently on the stage than they are in real life. An actor must usually learn how to dance, how to fence, and how to move naturally in period costumes. An actor must know what to do with his or her hands, when to let them hang and when to use them for expressive gestures. Furthermore, stage actors must know how to adjust their bodies to different characters. A 17-year-old girl moves differently than a woman of 30, an aristocrat moves differently than a clerk of the same age. The body must communicate a wide variety of emotions in pantomime. A happy person even stands differently than one who is dejected or fearful or bored. The setting for the scene is a dinner table. The heroine looks at her husband, who is eating as usual. Then a close-up shows a dish containing meat and vegetables with a knife and fork lying next to it. The wife's hands are seen behind the dish. Hitchcock then cuts to a medium shot of the wife thoughtfully slicing some meat. Next, a medium shot of the brother's empty chair. Close-up of the wife's hands with knife and fork. Close-up of a bird cage with canaries, a reminder to the heroine of her dead brother. Close-up of wife's thoughtful face. Close-up of the knife and plate. Suddenly a close-up of the husband's suspicious face. He notices the connection between the knife and her thoughtful expression, for the camera pans, rather than cuts, back to the knife. He gets up next to her. Hitchcock quickly cuts to a close-up of her hand reaching for the knife. Cut to an extreme close-up of the knife entering his body. Cut to a two-shot of their faces, his convulsed with pain, hers in fear. When Sylvia Sidney saw the finished product, she was delighted with the results. The entire scene, of course, required very little acting in the conventional sense. Generalizing about acting in movies is difficult because directors don't approach every film with the same attitudes. Elia Kazan and Ingmar Bergman, distinguished stage directors as well as filmmakers, varied their techniques considerably, depending on the dramatic needs of the film. Nor is there any correct approach to filming a scene. But whether a director is a realist or formalist, the differences between film acting and stage acting remain fundamental. For example, a player in movies is not so restricted by vocal requirements because sound volume is controlled electronically. Marilyn Monroe's small, girly voice wouldn't have projected beyond the first few rows in the theater, but on film it was perfect for conveying that childlike vulnerability that gave her performances such poetic delicacy. Some film actors are popular precisely because of the offbeat charm of their voices. Because acting in movies is not so dependent on vocal flexibility, many performers have succeeded despite their wooden, inexpressive voices. Gary Cooper, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Even the quality of a movie actor's voice can be controlled mechanically. Music and sound effects can totally change the meaning of a line of dialogue. Through electronic devices, a voice can be made to sound garbled or booming or hollow. Much of the dialogue in a movie is dubbed, so a director can re-record a line until it's perfect. Sometimes the director will select one or two words from one recorded take and blend them with the words of another, or even a third or fourth. This kind of synthesizing can be carried even further, by combining one actor's face with another actor's voice, 6 to 8. Similarly, the physical requirements for a film actor are different from those of a stage performer. The movie player doesn't have to be tall, even if he's a leading man type. Alan Ladd, for example, was quite short. His directors simply avoided showing his body in full unless there was no one else in frame to contrast with his height. He played love scenes standing on a box, his body cut off at the waist. Low-angle shots also tended to make him seem taller. A film actor's features don't have to be large, only expressive, particularly the eyes and mouth. Nor does a film actor have to be attractive. For example, Humphrey Bogart was not a good-looking man, but the camera liked him. That is, his face was uncannily photogenic, opening up to the camera in a way that often surprised his cinematographers. Sometimes this contrast between reality and its illusion can be intimidating. Complained Jean Arthur, "It's a strenuous job every day of your life to live up to the way you look on the screen." An actor who moves clumsily is not necessarily at a disadvantage in film. The director can work around the problem by not using many long shots and by photographing the actor after he or she has moved. Complicated movements can be faked by using stuntmen or stuntwomen or doubles. These shots are intercut with closer shots of the leading actor, and the edited juxtaposition leads the audience to assume that the main performer is involved in all the shots, see 417A and B. Even in close-up, the film performer's physical appearance can be changed through the use of special lenses, filters, and lights. Because the shot is the basic building unit in film, the actor doesn't have to sustain a performance for very long, even in realistic movies in which the takes can run for 2 or 3 minutes. In a highly fragmented film, in which shots can last for less than a second, one can scarcely refer to the performer's contribution as acting at all, he or she simply is. The shooting schedule of a movie is determined by economic considerations. Thus, the shooting of various sequences can be out of chronology. An actor may be required to perform the climactic scene first and low-keyed exposition shots later. The screen actor, then, doesn't build emotionally as the stage actor must. The film player must be capable of an intense degree of concentration, turning emotions on and off for very short periods of time. Most of the time, the player must seem totally natural, as if he or she weren't acting at all. You do it just like in reality, Henry Fonda explained, 6 to 10. Certainly the film player is almost always at the mercy of the director, who later constructs the various shots into a coherent performance. Some directors have tricked actors into a performance, asking for one quality to get another. Because acting in the cinema is confined to short segments of time and space, the film player doesn't need a long rehearsal period to establish a sense of ease with other actors, the set, or costumes. Many directors keep rehearsals to a minimum so as not to dissipate the spontaneity of the players, their sense of discovery and surprise. Unlike the stage player, the film actor doesn't have to create an intimate rapport with other performers, sometimes they haven't even met until they arrive on the set or on location. Actors occasionally don't know their lines. This is remedied by having a prompter on the set or by writing the lines on a chalkboard off frame where the actor can read them. A film actor is expected to play even the most intimate scenes with dozens of technicians on the set, working or observing, 6 to 1. The actors must seem totally at ease, even though the lights are unbearably hot and their running makeup must be corrected between shots. Because the camera distorts, actors are required to perform some scenes unnaturally. In an embrace, for example, lovers can't really look at each other in the eyes or they will appear cross-eyed on the screen. In point-of-view shots, actors must direct their lines at the camera rather than at another player. Much of the time, the performer has no idea what he or she is doing, or where a shot might appear in the finished film, if indeed it appears at all. For many, an actor's performance has been left on the cutting room floor. In short, the lack of continuity of time and space in movies places the performer almost totally in the hands of the director. The American Star System. The star system has been the backbone of the American film industry since the mid-1910s. Stars are the creation of the public, its reigning favorites. Their influence in the fields of fashion, values, and public behavior has been enormous. The social history of a nation can be written in terms of its film stars, Raymond Durnat has observed. Stars confer instant consequence to any film they appear in. Their fees have staggered the public. In the 1920s, Mary Pickford and Charles Chaplin were the two highest-paid employees in the world. Contemporary stars such as Julia Roberts and Tom Cruise command salaries of many millions per film, so popular are these box office giants. Some stars had careers that spanned 5 decades, Bette Davis and John Wayne, to name just two. Stars are the direct or indirect reflection of the needs, drives, and anxieties of their audience. They are the food of dreams, allowing us to live out our deepest fantasies and obsessions. Like the ancient gods and goddesses, stars have been adored, envied, and venerated as mythic icons. Prior to 1910, actors' names were almost never included in movie credits because producers feared the players would then demand higher salaries. But the public named their favorites anyway. Mary Pickford, for example, was first known by her character's name, Little Mary. From the beginning, the public often fused a star's artistic persona with his or her private personality, sometimes disastrously. For example, Ingrid Bergman's much-publicized love affair with Italian director Roberto Rossellini created a scandalous uproar in the United States in the late 1940s. It nearly wrecked her career, not to speak of her psyche. She was a victim of her own public image, which had been carefully nurtured by her boss, producer David O. Selznick. In the public mind, Bergman was a wholesome, almost saintly woman, modest and simple, a happy wife and mother. This image was buttressed by her most popular roles, the radiantly ethereal Ilsa in Casablanca, the fervent political idealist in For Whom the Bell Tolls, the warm, indomitable Mother Superior in The Bells of St. Mary's, and the noble warrior saint of Joan of Arc. In reality, Bergman was an ambitious artist, anxious to play a variety of roles, including villainous parts. When she and Rossellini met, they soon fell in love, and though still married to her first husband, Bergman became pregnant with Rossellini's child. When her condition became public, the press had a field day, indulging in an orgy of lurid speculations and attacking her for betraying her public. She was reviled by religious groups and even denounced from the floor of the U.S. Senate, where she was described as Hollywood's apostle of degradation and a free love cultist. Bergman and Rossellini married in 1950, but their joint movies were boycotted in the United States, and she remained out of the country for several years. She was apparently forgiven in 1956, when she won her second Academy Award, Best Actress, for her performance in Anastasia, a big box office success. Unless the public is receptive to a given screen personality, audiences can be remarkably resistant to someone else's notion of a star. For example, producer Samuel Goldwyn ballyhooed his Russian import, Anna Sten, without stinting on costs. But audiences stayed away from her movies in droves. God makes the stars, the chastened Goldwyn finally concluded. It's up to the producers to find them. The so-called golden age of the star system, roughly the 1930s and 1940s, coincided with the supremacy of the Hollywood studio system. Most of the stars during this period were under exclusive contract to the five major production companies, MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, known in the trade as the Big Five, or the Majors. Throughout this period, the Majors produced approximately 90% of the fiction films in America. They also ruled the international market. Between the two world wars, American movies dominated 80% of the world's screens and were more popular with foreign audiences than all but a few natively produced movies. In their first years under studio contract, stars were given maximum exposure. For example, Clark Gable appeared in 14 movies in 1930, his first year at MGM. Each of his roles represented a different type, and the studio kept varying them until one clicked with the public. After a particularly popular performance, a star was usually locked into the same type of role, often under protest. Because the demand for stars was the most predictable economic variable in the business of filmmaking, the studios used their stars as a guarantee of box office success. In short, stars provided some measure of stability in a traditionally volatile industry. To this day, stars are referred to as bankable commodities, that is, insurance for large profits to investors. The majors viewed their stars as valuable investments, and the build-up techniques developed by the studios involved much time, money, and energy. Promising neophytes served an apprenticeship as starlets, a term reserved for females, although male newcomers were subjected to the same treatment. They were often assigned a new name, were taught how to talk, walk, and wear costumes. Frequently their social schedules were arranged by the studio's publicity department to ensure maximum press exposure. Suitable romances were concocted to fuel the columns of the 400 or more reporters and columnists who covered the Hollywood beat during the studio era. A few zealous souls even agreed to marry a studio-selected spouse if such an alliance would further their careers. Though stars were often exploited by the studios, there were some compensations. As a player's box office power increased, so did his or her demands. Top stars had their names above the title of the film, and they often had script approval stipulated in their contracts. Some of them also insisted on director, producer, and co-star approval. Glamorous stars boasted their own camera operators, who knew how to conceal physical defects and enhance virtues. Many of them demanded their own clothes designers, hair stylists, and lavish dressing rooms. The biggest stars had movies especially tailored for them, thus guaranteeing maximum camera exposure. Top stars attracted the loyalty of both men and women, although as sociologist Leo Handel pointed out, 65% of the fans preferred stars of their own sex. The studios received up to 32 million fan letters per year, 85% of them from young females. Major stars received about 3,000 letters per week, and the volume of their mail was regarded as an accurate barometer of their popularity. The studio spent as much as $2 million a year processing these letters, most of which asked for autographed photos. Box office appeal was also gauged by the number of fan clubs devoted to a star. In the 1930s, the stars with the greatest number of fan clubs were Gable, Jean Harlow, and Joan Crawford, all of them under contract to MGM, the home of the stars. Gable alone had 70 clubs, which partly accounted for his supremacy as the top male star of the period. The mythology of stardom usually emphasizes the glamour of movie stars, lifting them above the mundane concerns of ordinary mortals. Critic Parker Tyler observed that stars fulfill an ancient need, almost religious in nature. Somehow their wealth, fame, and beauty, their apparently unlimited field of worldly pleasure, these conditions tinge them with the supernatural, render them immune to the bitterness of ordinary frustrations. Of course, this mythology also involves the tragic victims of stardom, like Marilyn Monroe, who became a symbol of the personal tragedy that can befall a star. She was born, illegitimate, to an emotionally unstable mother who spent most of her life in mental asylums. As a child, Norma Jean Mortensen, aka Norma Jean Baker, was raised in a series of orphanages and foster homes. Even then, especially then, she dreamed of becoming a famous Hollywood star. She was raped at the age of 8, married to her first husband at 16. She used sex, like many before her, as a means to an end, stardom. In the late 1940s, she had a few bit roles, mostly as sexy dumb blondes. Not until John Huston's The Asphalt Jungle, 1950, did she create much of a stir. In that same year, Joseph Mankiewicz cast her in All About Eve, as a graduate of the Copacabana School of Dramatic Art, as George Sanders dryly deadpans in the film. Sanders claimed he knew Marilyn would one day become a star because she desperately needed to be one. After 20th Century Fox signed her to a contract, the studio didn't know what to do with her. She appeared in a series of third-rate studio projects, but despite their mediocrity, the public clamored for more Marilyn. She rightly blamed Fox for mismanaging her career. Only the public can make a star. It's the studios who try to make a system of it, she bitterly complained. At the peak of her popularity, she left Hollywood in disgust to study at the Actors Studio. When she returned, she demanded more money and better roles, and got both. Joshua Logan, who directed her in Bus Stop, 1956, said she was as near genius as any actress I ever knew. Supremely photogenic, she gave herself entirely to the camera, allowing it to probe her deepest vulnerabilities. Laurence Olivier, her co-star and director in The Prince and the Showgirl, 1957, marveled at her cunning way of fusing guilelessness with carnality, the mind and soul of a little girl wrapped in the body of a whore. Throughout her years as a top star, her private life was a shambles. She was an unfortunate doped-up woman most of the time, biographer Maurice Solitow observed. Her failed marriages and love affairs were constantly in the headlines, and increasingly she turned to drugs and alcohol for solace. She was notorious for her irresponsibility, often not even bothering to show up on the set for days at a time, thus incurring enormous cost overruns. Because of her addiction to drugs and alcohol, even when she did show up, she scarcely knew who, much less where, she was. She was found dead in 1962, an overdose of barbiturates and alcohol, C622B. The realities behind the mythology of the stars is not very romantic. For every actor who manages to scale the peaks of stardom, there are hundreds of thousands who fail, their hard work wasted, their sacrifices scoffed at, their dreams shattered. Maureen Stapleton won important acting awards for her distinguished work in films, television, and the stage, but she spoke eloquently of the hardships actors must endure in a world that often regards them as fortunate simpletons. I believe in the toughness of actors. I have a feeling of genuine pride in actors as my people. We're called egomaniacs, we're thought of as children. Actors are supposed to be irresponsible, stupid, unaware, and a kind of joke. They're accused of having big egos. Well, the actor's ego is no different in size because he's an actor. A writer or a painter or a musician can go off into a corner and lick his wounds, but an actor stands out in front of the crowd and takes it. Actors spend years and years being treated like dirt. They're constantly in a state of debasement, making the rounds of casting directors and having to look happy and great. I made the rounds for years, but I wasn't good at it. But then nobody is. You need a very strong stomach. You need a sense of the business as a whole, so that you don't get lacerated every time somebody tells you you're lousy. You need strength, and no matter how strong you get, you always need to get stronger. Quoted in The Player, a profile of an art. The tabloids in supermarket racks are filled with lurid stories of how film stars have screwed up their lives or have made fools of themselves in public or behaved like selfish brats. These types of stories sell newspapers, for they appeal to the public's envy and malice. What is far less frequently written about is how stars are hounded out of their privacy by unscrupulous reporters and paparazzi. Nor do we often read about how stars like Bob Hope, Audrey Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor, and Natalie Portman have devoted thousands of hours to public service. Or the humanitarian work of stars like Sean Penn, Ben Stiller, Matt Damon, and Ben Affleck. Or about the patriotic activities of stars like Tom Hanks, John Wayne, or Marlene Dietrich. Or the successful political careers of stars like Shirley Temple and Ronald Reagan. Or the political activism of hundreds of stars like Marlon Brando and Jane Fonda. Or the fantastic generosity of stars like Barbra Streisand and Paul Newman. Newman alone donated over $330 million to various charities. He also set up a food company, Newman's Own, to continue aiding charities after his death. Contemporary film stars have become quite savvy in exploiting the public's fascination with their lives in order to promote their humanitarian work. George Clooney has worked tirelessly to publicize the genocide that has taken place in the Darfur region of Sudan in Africa. If you're going to be famous and have cameras follow you around, you might as well go where the cameras will do some good, Clooney pointed out. Perhaps the shrewdest philanthropists in the contemporary film industry are Angelina Jolie and her partner Brad Pitt. Their Jolie Pitt Foundation has contributed millions of dollars to such causes as rebuilding New Orleans after it was devastated by Hurricane Katrina. They have provided grants to such humanitarian groups as Doctors Without Borders and various AIDS relief organizations. They have visited refugee camps in war-torn areas in Africa, Afghanistan, and Iraq. They have testified before U.S. congressional committees about the torture and mutilation of women and children throughout Africa. Knowing that the press will hound them anyway, they have sold the rights to exclusive photos of their newborn children to magazines like People for a reported $14 million, which was then channeled into the Jolie Pitt Foundation. When the photos appeared in People, sales for the magazine went up 45%. Stars must pay a high price for their wealth and fame. They must get used to being treated like commodities with a price tag. Even at the beginning of the star system, they were reduced to simplified types, virgins, vamps, swashbucklers, flappers, and so on. Over the years, a vast repertory of types evolved: the Latin lover, the He-Man, the heiress, the good bad girl, the cynical reporter, the career girl, and many others. Of course, all great stars are unique even though they might fall into a well-known category. For example, the cheap blonde has long been one of America's favorite types, but such important stars as Mae West, Jean Harlow, and Marilyn Monroe are highly distinctive as individuals. A successful type was always imitated. In the mid-1920s, for example, the Swedish import Greta Garbo created a sophisticated and complex type, the femme fatale. Garbo inspired many imitations, including such important stars as Marlene Dietrich and Carole Lombard, who were first touted as Garbo types, only with a sense of humor. In the 1950s, Sidney Poitier became the first African-American star to attract a wide following outside of his own race. In later years, a number of other black performers attained stardom in part because Poitier had established the precedent. He was one of the great originals and hence worthy of imitation. At about the turn of the 19th century, George Bernard Shaw wrote a famous essay comparing the two foremost stage stars of the day, Eleonora Duse and Sarah Bernhardt. Shaw's comparison is a useful springboard for a discussion of the different kinds of film stars. Bernhardt, Shaw wrote, was a bravura personality, and she managed to tailor each different role to fit this personality. This is what her fans both expected and desired. Her personal charm was larger than life, yet undeniably captivating. Her performances were filled with brilliant effects that had come to be associated with her personality over the years. Duse, on the other hand, possessed a more quiet talent, less dazzling in its initial impact. She was totally different with each role, and her own personality never seemed to intrude on the playwright's character. Hers was an invisible art. Her impersonations were so totally believable that the viewer was likely to forget it was an impersonation. In effect, Shaw was pointing out the major distinctions between a personality star and an actor star. Personality stars commonly refuse all parts that go against their type, especially if they're leading men or leading ladies. Performers like Tom Hanks almost never play cruel or psychopathic roles, for example, because such parts would conflict with their sympathetic image. If a star is locked into his or her type, any significant departure can result in box office disaster. For example, when Pickford tried to abandon her little girl roles in the 1920s, her public stayed at home. They wanted to see Little Mary or nothing. She retired in disgust at the age of 40, just when most players are at the peak of their powers. On the other hand, many stars prefer to remain in the same mold, playing variations on the same character type. John Wayne was the most popular star in film history. From 1949 to 1976, he was absent from the top 10 only 3 times. "I play John Wayne in every part regardless of the character, and I've been doing okay, haven't I?" he once asked. In the public mind, he was a man of action and violence, rather than words. His iconography is steeped in a distrust of sophistication and intellectuality. His name is virtually synonymous with masculine ity, though his persona suggests more of the warrior than the lover, a man's man rather than a lady's man. As he grew older, he also grew more human, developing his considerable talents as a comedian by mocking his own macho image. Wayne was fully aware of the enormous influence a star can wield in transmitting values, and in many of his films, he embodied a right-wing ideology that made him a hero to conservative Americans, including Ronald Reagan, Newt Gingrich, Oliver North, and Pat Buchanan. Ironically, as Gary Wills points out in his cultural study, John Wayne's America, The Politics of Celebrity, Wayne actually disliked horses, though in the popular imagination he was the archetypal Westerner on a horse, 10-3A. He also consciously evaded the military draft during World War II, yet his roles in such popular films as The Sands of Iwo Jima, 7-15, firmly established him as a military exemplar. From now on, Wills points out, the man who evaded service in World War II would be the symbolic man who won World War II. In short, a star's iconographical status can actually contradict historical truth. In a 1995 poll, John Wayne, who had been dead for over 16 years, was named America's all-time favorite movie star. In a 2012 Harris poll, Wayne was listed as America's No. 3 favorite star, after Johnny Depp and Denzel Washington. Film theorist Richard Dyer has pointed out that stars are signifying entities. Any sensitive analysis of a film with a star in its cast must take into account that star's iconographical significance. Stars like Jane Fonda have embodied complex political associations simply by demonstrating the lifestyle of their politics and displaying those political beliefs as an aspect of their personality/characterization. Like John Wayne, and most other stars, Fonda's films convey an ideology, usually implying ideal ways of behaving. As such, stars can have tremendous impact in transmitting values. Dyer also tests how a star's iconography is always developing, incorporating elements from the star's actual life as well as previous roles. For example, Fonda's career can be divided into 6 phases. 1. The father. Her entry into the film industry in 1960 was facilitated by Henry Fonda's prestige. Physically, she clearly resembled him, and he too was a well-known liberal, with an all-American iconography. Jane's roles during this period emphasized a rambunctious sexiness, with more of the tomboy than the siren. This phase culminated in Cat Ballou, 1965. 2. Sex. This period is dominated by Fonda's French film director husband, Roger Vadim, who exploited her good looks and sensational figure in a series of erotic films, most notably Barbarella, 1968. Although the marriage ended in divorce, Fonda claimed that Vadim liberated her from her sexual hang-ups and naivete. 3. Acting. Fonda returned to America, where she studied with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio in New York. Her depth and range as an artist expanded considerably during this period, and she was nominated for an Academy Award for her work in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? 1969. She won one for her performance as a prostitute in Klute, 1971. 4. Politics. Fonda was radicalized by Vietnam and the women's movement. She spoke out frequently against the war, racism, and sexism. She also politicized her work, starring in movies that were frankly ideological, like Tout va bien, France, 1972, A Doll's House, Britain, 1973, and Julia, 1977. Her left-wing political activities adversely affected her box office popularity for a period, but she continued to speak out on important public issues, refusing to be intimidated. 5. Independence. Fonda's own production company produced Coming Home, 1978. She enjoyed outstanding success as a producer. She also wrote several books and was a leader in the physical fitness movement. 6. Later years and private life. When she married media mogul Ted Turner, Fonda retired from acting in 1992. After their divorce, she returned to acting with Monster-in-Law, 6-15, a commercial success. In 2009, at the age of 71, she returned to the Broadway stage, to considerable critical acclaim. 619 See the Help, U.S.A., 2011, with Viola Davis, directed by Tate Taylor. Viola Davis is one of the leading African American actors of her generation. She has worked in film and television as well as the New York stage, where she has won 2 Tony Awards. A graduate of the prestigious Juilliard School, she won an Oscar nomination for her brief cameo role in Doubt, 2008. Her performance as the nurturing maid, Aibileen Clark, in this film also won her an Academy Award nomination as Best Actress, opposite her good friend, Meryl Streep, who won. Even today, the kind of roles offered to black performers tend to be limited. As Davis pointed out, you're not doing the Irish and Scottish accents they taught at Juilliard. In the real world, you're doing Ebonics and Jamaican. Nonetheless, even within this limited range, Davis always manages to project a sense of decency and humanity. The top box office attractions tend to be personality stars. They stay on top by being themselves, not by trying to impersonate anyone. Gable insisted that all he did in front of the camera was to act natural. Similarly, Marilyn Monroe was always at her best when she played roles that exploited her indecisiveness, her vulnerability, and her pathetic eagerness to please. On the other hand, there have been many stars who refuse to be typecast and attempt the widest array of roles possible. Such actor-stars as Johnny Depp and Reese Witherspoon have sometimes undertaken unpleasant character roles rather than conventional leads to expand their range, for variety and breadth have traditionally been the yardsticks by which great acting is measured. Many stars fall somewhere between the two extremes, veering toward personality in some films, toward impersonation in others. Such gifted performers as James Stewart, Cary Grant, and Audrey Hepburn played wider variations of certain types of roles. Nonetheless, we couldn't imagine a star like Hepburn playing a woman of weak character or a coarse or stupid woman, so firmly entrenched was her image as an elegant and rather aristocratic female. Similarly, most people know what's meant by the Clint Eastwood type. The distinction between a professional actor and a star is not based on technical skill, but on mass popularity. By definition, a star must have enormous personal magnetism, a riveting quality that commands our attention. Few public personalities have inspired such deep and widespread affection as the great movie stars. Some are loved because they embody such traditional American values as plain speaking, integrity, and idealism. Gary Cooper and Tom Hanks are examples of this type. Others are identified with anti-establishment images and include such celebrated loners as Bogey, Clint Eastwood, and Jack Nicholson. Players such as Cary Grant and Carole Lombard are so captivating in their charm that they're fun to watch in almost anything. And of course, many of them are spectacularly good-looking. Names like Angelina Jolie and George Clooney are virtually synonymous with godlike beauty. Sophisticated filmmakers exploit the public's affection for its stars by creating ambiguous tensions between a role as written, as acted, and as directed. Whenever the hero isn't portrayed by a star, the whole picture suffers, Hitchcock observed. Audiences are far less concerned about the predicament of a character who's played by someone they don't know. When a star rather than a conventional actor plays a role, much of the characterization is automatically fixed by the casting, but what the director and star then choose to add to the written role is what constitutes its full dramatic meaning. Some directors have capitalized on the star system with great artistic effectiveness, especially studio-era filmmakers. 622A. Perhaps the ultimate glory for a star is to become an icon in American popular mythology. Like the gods and goddesses of ancient times, some stars are so universally known that one name alone is enough to evoke an entire complex of symbolic associations. Marilyn, for example. Unlike the conventional actor, however gifted, the star automatically suggests ideas and emotions that are deeply embedded in his or her persona. These undertones are determined not only by the star's previous roles, but often by his or her actual personality as well. Naturally, over the course of many years, this symbolic information can begin to drain from public consciousness, but the iconography of a great star like Gary Cooper becomes part of a shared experience. As the French critic Edgar Morin has pointed out, when Cooper played a character, he automatically Gary Cooperized it, infusing himself into the role and the role into himself. Because audiences felt a deep sense of identification with Coop and the values he symbolized, in a sense they were celebrating themselves, or at least their spiritual selves. The great originals are cultural archetypes, and their box office popularity is an index of their success in synthesizing the aspirations of an era. As a number of cultural studies have shown, the iconography of a star can involve communal myths and symbols of considerable complexity and emotional richness. Styles of acting. Acting styles differ radically, depending on period, genre, tone, national origins, and directorial emphasis. Such considerations are the principal means by which acting styles are classified. Even within a given category, however, generalizations are, at best, a loose set of expectations, not holy writ. For example, the realist-formalist dialectic that has been used as a classification aid throughout this book can also be applied to the art of acting, but there are many variations and subdivisions. These terms are also subject to different interpretations from period to period. Lillian Gish was regarded as a great realistic actress in the silent era, but by today's standards, her performances look rather ethereal. In a parallel vein, the playing style of Klaus Kinski in such movies as Aguirre, The Wrath of God, 6-23, is stylized, but compared to an extreme form of expressionistic acting, such as that of Conrad Veidt in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 7-16, Kinski is relatively realistic. It's a matter of degree. Classifying acting styles according to national origins is also likely to be misleading, at least for those countries that have evolved a wide spectrum of styles, such as Japan, the United States, and Italy. For example, the Italians, and other Mediterranean peoples, are said to be theatrical by national temperament, acting out their feelings with animation, as opposed to the reserved deportment of the Swedes and other Northern Europeans. But within the Italian cinema alone, these generalizations are subject to considerable modification. Southern Italian characters tend to be acted in a manner that conforms to the volatile Latin stereotype, as can be seen in the movies of Lina Wertmuller, 6-24. Northern Italians, on the other hand, are usually played with more restraint and far less spontaneity, as the works of Antonioni demonstrate. Genre and directorial emphasis also influence acting styles significantly. For example, in such stylized genres as the samurai film, Toshiro Mifune is bold, strutting, and larger than life, as in Kurosawa's Yojimbo. In a realistic contemporary story like High and Low, also directed by Kurosawa, Mifune's performance is all nuance and sobriety. The art of silent acting encompasses a period of only some 15 years or so, for though movies were being produced as early as 1895, most historians regard Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, 1915, as the first indisputable masterpiece of the silent cinema. The changeover to sound was virtually universal by 1930. Within this brief span, however, a wide variety of playing styles evolved, ranging from the detailed, underplayed realism of Gibson Goland in Greed, to the grand, ponderous style of such tragedians as Emil Yawning's In the Last Command. The great silent clowns like Chaplin, Keaton, Harold Lloyd, Harry Langdon, and Laurel and Hardy also developed highly personal styles that bear only a superficial resemblance to each other. A popular misconception about the silent cinema is that all movies were photographed and projected at silent speed 16 frames per second, FPS. In fact, silent speed was highly variable, subject to easy manipulation because cameras were hand-cranked. Even within a single film, not every scene was necessarily photographed at the same speed. Generally speaking, comic scenes were undercranked to emphasize speed, whereas dramatic scenes were overcranked to slow down the action, usually 20 or 22 FPS. Because most present-day projectors feature only two speeds, 16 silent and 24 sound, the original rhythms of the performances are violated. This is why actors in silent dramas can appear jerky and slightly ludicrous. In comedies, this distortion can enhance the humor, which is why the performances of the silent clowns have retained much of their original charm. Outside the comic repertory, however, due allowances must be made for the distortions of technology. The most popular and critically admired player of the silent cinema was Chaplin. The wide variety of comic skills he developed in his early years of vaudeville made him the most versatile of the clowns. In the area of pantomime, no one approached his inventiveness. Critics waxed eloquently on his balletic grace, and even the brilliant dancer Vaslav Nijinsky proclaimed Chaplin his equal. His ability to blend comedy with pathos was unique. George Bernard Shaw, the greatest living playwright of this era, described Chaplin as the only genius developed in motion pictures. After viewing Chaplin's powerful and very funny performance in City Lights, the fastidious critic Alexander Woollcott, who otherwise loathed movies, said, "I would be prepared to defend the proposition that this darling of the mob is the foremost living artist." Greta Garbo perfected a romantic style of acting that had its roots in the silent cinema and held sway throughout the 1930s. Critics have sometimes referred to this mode of performance as star acting. "What, when drunk, one sees in other women, one sees in Garbo sober," said the British critic Kenneth Tynan. Almost invariably, MGM cast her as a woman with a mysterious past, mistress, courtesan, the other woman the essence of the eternal female. Her face, in addition to being stunningly beautiful, could unite conflicting emotions, withholding and yielding simultaneously, like a succession of waves rippling across her features. Tall and slender, she moved gracefully, her collapsed shoulders suggesting the exhaustion of a wounded butterfly. She could also project a provocative bisexuality, as in Queen Christina, where her resolute strides and masculine attire provide a foil to her exquisite femininity. The most important British film actors are also the most prominent in the live theatre. The British repertory system was the envy of the civilized world. Virtually every medium-sized city once had a resident drama company, where actors could learn their craft by playing a variety of roles from the classic repertory, especially the works of Shakespeare. As players improved, they rose through the ranks, attempting more complex roles. The best of them migrated to the larger cities, where the most prestigious theatre companies were found. The discipline that most British actors acquired in this repertory system made them the most versatile of players. The finest of them were regularly employed in the theatres of London, which is also adjacent to the centers of film production in Britain. This centralization allowed them to move from the live theater to film to TV with a minimum of inconvenience. Today, British actors usually enter the profession via several years' training at a recognized drama school, although the emphasis placed on stage acting in these institutions reflects the heritage of the old repertory system. In the acting profession, playing Shakespeare is considered the artistic summit. If you can act in Shakespeare convincingly, the argument goes, you can act in anything, because Shakespeare requires the broadest range of an actor's technical skills and artistic insight. Shakespeare's language is 400 years old and so archaic that even highly literate people are likely to miss as much as a fourth of the dialogue. To recite the language clearly, which itself is no easy feat, is absolutely mandatory. But that's not enough, the dialogue must be spoken with feeling. By flesh and blood human beings. That's a lot tougher. Take Hamlet's final speech at the end of Act 2, when he gives vent to his self-contempt for not avenging his father's murder.
Why, what an ass am I! This is most brave that I, the son of a dear murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must like a whore unpack my heart with words, and fall a-cursing like a very drab, a scullion. Fie upon it, foe!
Because the dialogue is in verse, the actor must avoid the temptation of a sing-song monotony on the one hand, or at the other extreme, to deliver the musical lines with a prosy inflection in an effort to make the speech sound more realistic. The language must be pronounced crisply or the audience will never be able to make out such odd words as murthered, drab, and scullion. The actor must be skilled enough to convey the emotional content of these words even though most modern audiences are not likely to know their precise meaning. Fie and foe were common interjections to express disapproval in Shakespeare's day, but of course no one uses these expressions today. In short, it takes more than technique, intelligence, and chutzpah to successfully play a role as tough as Hamlet. It takes a kind of genius. 626b. British acting has traditionally tended to favor a mastery of externals, based on close observation, with players being trained in diction, movement, makeup, dialects, fencing, dancing, body control, and ensemble acting. For example, Laurence Olivier always built his characters from the outside in. He molded his features like a sculptor or painter. I do not search the character for parts that are already in me, he explained, but go out and find the personality I feel the author created. Like most British actors of his generation, Olivier had a keen memory for details. I hear remarks in the street or in a shop and I retain them. You must constantly observe, a walk, a limp, a run, how a head inclines to one side when listening, the twitch of an eyebrow, the hand that picks the nose when it thinks no one is looking, the mustache puller, the eyes that never look at you, the nose that sniffs long after the cold has gone. Makeup for Olivier was magical. He loved hiding his real features behind beards, false complexions, fake noses, and wigs. If you're wise, he warned, you always take off the part with your makeup. He also prided himself on his ability to mimic dialects. I always go to endless trouble to learn American accents, even for small television parts. If it's North Michigan, it's bloody well got to be North Michigan. Olivier kept his body in peak condition. Even as an old man, he continued running and lifting weights. When illness curbed these forms of exercises, he took to swimming. At the age of 78, he was still swimming half a mile almost every morning. To be fit should be one of the actor's first priorities, he insisted. To exercise daily is of utmost importance. The body is an instrument which must be finely tuned and played as often as possible. The actor should be able to control it from the tip of his head to his little toe. Quotes are from Laurence Olivier on Acting, New York. Simon & Schuster, 1986. Contemporary British acting has moved beyond this classical style. 6-27. The post-World War II era tended to emphasize realistic styles of acting. In the early 1950s, a new interior style of acting, known as the method, or the system, was introduced to American movie audiences. It was commonly associated with director Elia Kazan. Kazan's On the Waterfront was a huge success and a virtual showcase for this style of performance. It has since become the dominant style of acting in the American cinema as well as the live theater. The method was an offshoot of a system of training actors and rehearsing that had been Developed by Konstantin Stanislavski at the Moscow Art Theater. Stanislavski's ideas were widely adopted in New York theater circles, especially by the Actors Studio in New York, which received much publicity during the 1950s because it had developed such well-known graduates as Marlon Brando, James Dean, Julie Harris, Paul Newman, and many others. Kazan co-founded and taught at the Actors Studio until 1954, when he asked his former mentor, Lee Strasberg, to take over the organization. Within a short period, Strasberg became the most celebrated acting teacher in America, and his former students were, and still are, among the most famous performers in the world. The central credo of Stanislavski's system was, you must live the part every moment you are playing it. He rejected the tradition of acting that emphasized externals. He believed that truth in acting can only be achieved by exploring a character's inner spirit, which must be fused with the actor's own emotions. One of the most important techniques he developed is emotional recall, in which an actor delves into his or her own past to discover feelings that are analogous to those of the character. In every part you do, Julie Harris explained, there is some connection you can make with your own background or with some feeling you've had at one time or another. Stanislavski's techniques were strongly psychoanalytical. By exploring their own subconscious, actors could trigger real emotions, which are recalled in every performance and transferred to the characters they are playing. He also devised techniques for helping actors focus their concentration on the world of the play, its concrete details. In some form or another, these techniques are probably as old as the acting profession itself, but Stanislavski was the first to systematize them with exercises and methods of analysis, hence the terms the system and the method. He didn't think that inner truth and emotional sincerity were sufficient. He insisted that actors need to master the externals as well, particularly for classic plays, which require a somewhat stylized manner of speaking, moving, and wearing costumes. Stanislavski was famous for his lengthy rehearsal periods, in which players were encouraged to improvise with their roles to discover the resonances of the text, the subtext, which is analogous to Freud's concept of the subconscious. Kazan and other method-oriented directors use this concept in directing movies. The film director knows that beneath the surface of his screenplay there is a subtext, a calendar of intentions and feelings and inner events. What appears to be happening, he soon learns, is rarely what is happening. The subtext is one of the film director's most valuable tools. It is what he directs. Spoken dialogue is secondary for method players. To capture a character's inner events, actors sometimes throw away their lines, choke on them, or even mumble. Throughout the 1950s, method actors like Brando and Dean were ridiculed by some critics for mumbling their lines. Stanislavski disapproved of the star system and individual virtuosity. In his own productions, he insisted on ensemble playing, with genuine interactions among the actor/characters. Players were encouraged to analyze all the specifics of a scene. What does the character really want? What is his or her history, or backstory? What has happened prior to the immediate moment? What time of day is it? And so on. When presented with a role utterly foreign to their experience, actors were urged to research the part so it would be understood in their guts as well as their minds. Method actors are famous for their ability to bring out the emotional intensity of their characters. Method-oriented directors generally believe that a player must have a character's experience within him or her, and they go to considerable lengths to learn about the personal lives of their players in order to use such details for characterization. In the 1960s, the French New Wave directors, especially Godard and Truffaut, popularized the technique of improvisation while their players were on camera. The resultant increase in realism was highly praised by critics. Of course, there was nothing new in the technique itself. Actors often improvised in the silent cinema, and it was the foundation of silent comedy. For example, Chaplin, Keaton, and Laurel and Hardy needed to know only the premise of a given scene. The comic details were improvised and later refined in the editing stage. The cumbersome technology of sound put an end to most of these practices. Method-trained actors use improvisation primarily as an exploratory rehearsal technique, but their performances are usually set when the camera begins to roll. Godard and Truffaut, to capture a greater sense of discovery and surprise, would occasionally instruct their players to make up their dialogue while a scene was actually being photographed. The flexible technology introduced by Cinéma Vérité allowed these directors to capture an unprecedented degree of spontaneity. In Truffaut's The 400 Blows, for example, the 13-year-old protagonist, Jean-Pierre Léaud, is interviewed by a prison psychologist about his family life and sexual habits. Drawing heavily on his own experience, Léaud, who wasn't informed of the questions in advance, answers them with disarming frankness. Truffaut's camera is able to capture the boy's hesitations, his embarrassment, and his charming macho bravado. In one form or another, improvisation has become a valuable technique in the contemporary cinema. Such filmmakers as Robert Altman, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, and Martin Scorsese have used it with brilliant results. Casting. Casting a movie is almost an art in itself. It requires an acute sensitivity to a player's type, a convention inherited from the live theater. Most stage and screen performers are classified according to role categories: leading men, leading ladies, character actors, juveniles, villains, light comedians, tragedians, ingenues, singing actors, dancing actors, and so on. Typing conventions are rarely violated. For example, even though homely people obviously fall in love, romantic roles are almost always performed by attractive players. Similarly, audiences are not likely to be persuaded by a player with an all-American iconography, like Bruce Willis, cast in European roles. Nor is one likely to accept a performer like Klaus Kinski as the boy next door, unless one lives in a very weird neighborhood. Of course, a player's range is all important in determining his or her type. Some, like Nicole Kidman, have extremely broad ranges, whereas others, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, are confined to variations of the same two types, one comic, one menacing. Typecasting was almost invariable in the silent cinema. In part, this was because characters tended toward allegorical types rather than unique individuals and often were even identified with a label: the man, the wife, the mother, the vamp, and so on. Blonde players were usually cast in parts emphasizing purity, earthy brunettes in erotic roles. Eisenstein insisted that players ought to be cast strictly to type and was inclined to favor non-professionals because of their greater authenticity. Why use an actor to impersonate a factory worker, he asked, when a filmmaker can use a real factory worker instead? But trained actors resent being typed and often attempt to broaden their range. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Humphrey Bogart is a good example. For years, he was stereotyped as a tough, cynical gangster, until he joined forces with director John Huston, who cast him as the hard-boiled detective Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon. Huston weaned him even further from his type in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, in which Bogart played a crafty paranoid, the prospector Fred C. Dobbs. The actor totally reversed his image in The African Queen, in which he played Charlie Allnut, a lovable and funny drunk whose vulnerability endeared him to audiences and won Bogart an Academy Award for Best Actor. But in Beat the Devil, Huston's celebrated casting instincts deserted him when he used Bogart in a role beyond his powers, as a sophisticated adventurer stranded with a shabby assortment of rogues and loons. The witty tongue-in-cheek dialogue fell flat in Bogart's self-conscious performance. A polished player like Cary Grant could have acted the part with much greater believability and grace.